midterms. But I can guarantee this is very similar to what you are seeing in polling data right now. And when you put this all together, we at the Environmental Voter Project approximate that 8 million already registered voters, or already registered, stayed home and didn't cast a ballot in the last presidential election. 8 million. And I know I see some of you like shaking your heads, and I get it. It can be frustrating. But what I'd like to suggest to you is that this is an opportunity. We live in a moment in time where it's become almost impossible to change people's minds about climate change. But what these people represent are people who don't need their minds changed. They are with us. They already list climate and other environmental issues as their #1 priority over all other issues, yet they aren't voting. They don't need their minds changed. They need their behavior changed. And I won't claim that's easy. Obviously, it's not. But it is easier. And it's also often cheaper. This is what we focus on, and this is what I hope many of you will be focusing on the coming weeks and months. And in particular, there is one really, really important reason that I want to drill down on for the next few minutes as to why it is so, so important to find these non-voting environmentalists and get them to vote. And that is this. Who you vote for is secret. Whether you vote or not is public record. You know something's important when the speaker literally writes, "key point," right? Okay. If there is only one thing you remember from my presentation today, literally let it be this. Whether you vote or not is public record. Take it from someone who has run dozens of campaigns. This is how the first meeting in any political campaign goes. They open up their laptops. They look at public voter files. Because whether you vote or not is public record. And they say, okay, we've got limited time, we've got limited money. Who are we going to talk to, and who are we not going to talk to? And let's say you're running a gubernatorial campaign. Well, these people over here, not even registered to vote. Forget them. You're registered to vote, but look at public voter files. You haven't cast a ballot. Forget you. Oh, you people do vote, but only in presidential elections. Oh, you vote in midterms. That's great. And in gubernatorial elections, we're definitely going to target you. Oh, and you even vote in local elections. Well done. We're going to target you as well. And not to be creepy about it, but we literally know every single one of you likely voters by name and street address. And we know all of you by name and street address. And so if I'm running a gubernatorial campaign, and I've got limited time and limited money, and my only goal is to get 50% plus one of the vote on a Tuesday in November, and I know who has a history of showing up in the election I'm trying to win, well, who do you think I'm going to contact? And perhaps even more importantly, who do you think I'm going to poll to figure out what issues they care about? These people. And I know this sounds cynical, but the simple truth is that politicians don't care about what non-voters think. They don't. And that's something that we accept in every other aspect of our lives, right? Like, do we expect Starbucks to care about you if you don't drink coffee? I've got a 7-year-old and a 10-year-old at home. Do we expect Ford Motor Company to market their cars to my children? My children can't drive. My children can't buy a $60,000 vehicle. No, Ford Motor Company markets their cars to drivers, just like politicians market themselves to voters. And so right now, we have this situation where politicians, for obvious reasons, because you know what, they really like to get elected, are paying attention to you over here, but the majority of the environmentalists are over here. And yes, that is frustrating, but it is a solvable problem. And this is the work that we do with many of you at Citizens Climate Lobby and the Environmental Voter Project every single day. Another way to think about this is we are heading into an election where often we are thinking about, okay, what is the country thinking? And no campaign thinks that way. We might have 260 million adults in the United States, but they can't vote. We have 240 million eligible voters in the United States, but they can't vote either, because we have to do this weird thing called like registering before we can even vote. Even if we're allowed to vote, you need to register. We've got 221 million registered voters. Did they all show up? Nope. Last presidential election, highest turnout in American history, 160 million voters. We probably won't hit that again. 22, the midterm, had 112 million. This is how you need to start thinking, especially in the political context. Voters, for better or for worse, carry much more political power with them than non-voters do. And again, I'm going to say it a few more times so you don't forget it. Whether you vote or not is public record. It is public record. And it just so happens that if you're thinking about the people who care deeply about climate, there are a lot of them among registered voters, depending on the year, anywhere from like 18 to 23 million, but far fewer of them cast ballots in presidential elections or in midterm elections. And our job is to find these people who are already registered to vote and list climate as their top priority and push them into the electorate. Because when we do that, not only do we change the outcomes in particular elections, but we change how politicians make policy. Because if there is just one thing that Democrats and Republicans all agree on even now, it is, boy, do they all really like winning elections. I mean, nothing motivates a politician more than the prospect of winning or losing elections. And so they go where the votes are. It's the brutal arithmetic of how democracy works. Either you go where the votes are, or you don't get to be a politician anymore. And so if we work hard for the next 149 days, flooding the polls with climate voters, every time you are visiting a policymaker's office, it will become easier and easier and easier to convince them to lead on climate. Because even the most courageous politician has to be a politician. They need to win election. And that's why this work is so important. So please view this as an opportunity. I love CCL, and I love how you talk about building the political will for climate leadership. And part of that is flooding this political marketplace with climate voters. And so what we're looking at here at the Environmental Voter Project, the nonprofit that I run, we only work in 19 states. We're not as big as CCL yet. But just in these 19 states, we have individually identified 4.8 million already registered voters who list climate or other environmental issues as their #1 priority, yet they are unlikely to vote. And why do we think they're unlikely to vote? Because whether you vote or not is public record. And we looked and we saw they didn't vote in 2020 or any election since then. And we know these people by name and street address. And we've run hundreds of randomized control trials telling us which messages work best over which communications media delivered to which subgroups of these voters to turn them from non-voters to new voters to consistent voters. And so please consider the next 149 days as an opportunity for you to have an enormous impact. Brett's going to come up soon and tell you about all of the ways that EVP and CCL are working together to try to build turnout in the climate movement. But just very briefly, weekly phone banks. Weekly phone banks every Wednesday evening or Wednesday in the afternoon if you're on the Pacific Coast. We are running phone banks. There is always someone there to answer your questions. We always provide training. And once you get trained, we'll just give you the information and you can call on your own. I know many of you are part of our postcarding campaigns. We're sending tested postcards to these non-voting environmentalists. We're also running door-to-door canvassing in Tucson, Austin, Pittsburgh, and Philadelphia. And finally, I'll just say, even if you do none of those things, although, oh my gosh, do I hope you do, take it from someone who runs a nonprofit that thinks about behavioral science every day. One of the most important things you can do is be loud and proud as a climate voter. Human beings are social animals, and all of your friends and peers look to you as an example of what it means to be a climate activist. And you need them to think that voting is the highest duty of climate activists this year. So please, I would love to see you on phone banks or in postcarding parties or knocking on doors. And I ask you, as the last thing to do before I leave the stage, I ask you to consider where you will be 149 days from now. Yeah, I know. You're gonna feel anxious, and you don't wanna have any regrets. And so do yourself a favor. You don't need to worry. I absolve you of worrying over the next 4.5, 5 months. This is a time for action. Get involved so that when you do start worrying, you know that you don't have any regrets. All right, thank you, folks. Thank you.
We so appreciate you. Thank you, Nathaniel. Thank you. Yeah. I know I speak for all of us here in the room with how much gratitude I have for the Environmental Voter Project. I was just looking it up. It was 5 years ago that we had you on our monthly call for the first time, Nathaniel, and the work that you and all of EVP have been doing these last 5 years has been absolutely transformational. So thank you from the bottom of our collective hearts. All right, so we are actually going to dive into the topic of elections connected to CCL, because I'm guessing if you're like me, you might be noticing the topic of voting coming up more and more in your communities as we get closer to the election day. So we wanted to make sure to share with you an update on how CCL has already been engaging in elections-related activities this year, and how you and your team can also add to your climate advocacy toolkit by getting engaged after this conference. And before I jump into this overview, I just want to give a special shout out and thanks to my colleagues Stephanie Munguia as well as Tony Cerna, who helped prepare this presentation. So a big shout out to all of their work as well. Specifically, we want to narrow in on what we can do as CCLers to make an impact by continuing to build on our unique strengths. And what are they, you might be asking? Well, I'm talking about 3 things: grassroots power, relentless yet respectful appreciation, and nonpartisanship. So that first one, let's dive into each of them, is that we are already in communities across this country. Districts of all political leanings and demographic makeups have trained advocates ready to jump in and talk about their favorite thing, the need for climate action. And that's some real grassroots power across the country that we can leverage to fundamentally shift the conversation around climate as a voting issue. We can do this through a lot of different ways, and which you choose is going to be ultimately up to what your strengths and interests are. So if you and your chapter are trusted messengers in your community, you can use that to amplify the information that's already circulating around climate and elections, like we've heard Nathaniel already highlight, sharing resources on social media, penning op-eds or letters to the editor that help your community members make that connection between climate change and voting. And you can also do the following: signing up to table in your community to encourage people to register and vote. There's an election season tabling kit on, guess where? CCL Community. And if your state is doing enough to get out the vote already, try hosting a postcarding party with your chapter. I know, looking around the room, we've had dozens of groups that have already been engaged on this, having a lot of fun and inviting your friends and family to join in. Our volunteers in Washington State would also love help from all of us across the country to send postcards about ballot initiative 2117, which would roll back their climate law, including the carbon price. So know that all across the country, there's opportunities and chapters coming up with creative ideas to spread the word about being a climate voter. And for example, I know that CCL Wisconsin is planning to send 20,000 postcards for both the primary and the general election. We have, yeah, you can give a round of applause. That's a big number, but just wait. CCL Texas is planning to send 40,000. Well, all right, I guess everything is bigger in Texas. And as a CCL community, collectively, we plan to send 54,000 postcards during the primary election and an additional 105,000 during the general election. So yesterday alone, those of you that already jumped in feet first at our postcarding workshop in the afternoon helped us jumpstart that process by sending hundreds of postcards. So big round of applause for all of you that have already initiated and made that happen. Amen. So if your schedule is flexible or you also have more time on your hands, you can also show up to the following: town halls, candidate forums, asking climate questions. We're going to have more training on this throughout the summer. In too many races, climate barely gets brought up still in this day and age. And how can anybody be informed as a climate voter if candidates never have the chance publicly to answer and respond to questions being asked about their own climate plans? We can fill that gap and make a difference, and as CCLers, make sure that every candidate event includes a climate question. That's a personal challenge I know we're all up for the occasion on. We also know this: our second strength is a throwback to what CCL's founder, Marshall Saunders, said when he described what was needed to address climate change. When he described the group that we would ultimately become, he told the world the story of us being relentless and unstoppable, yet friendly and respectful. We must lean into this balance. So every time that you interact with a candidate, remind them that you care about climate, even if it's the 10th time that you've brought that up. Be relentless and respectful. And as I said earlier, we must challenge ourselves in these months heading into the election to venture outside of our comfort zone and push ourselves to shake hands, state cases, and say something like what I might imagine saying at an event. I care about climate change because with our rapidly warming winters, I want my two sons to have the same winter outdoor recreation opportunities that I've had growing up. What is your climate plan to address and solve this if elected? This is our special strength, because even in a political landscape that paints CCL and climate change out to be a wedge and not a bridge issue, we know how to have a respectful conversation about climate action. And in fact, looking around the room, all of you collectively, since April 1st, have helped us achieve over 31,000 of these conversations. A huge round of applause for the efforts that you've made in having each and every one of those conversations. Thank you. We'll be hearing more about those conversations tomorrow on the next panel. And in addition to our persistence in talking to candidates, we also should be persistent in talking to our community members, our friends, our family, our loved ones. These all don't have to be in-person conversations, but this summer and fall, get out there and table with a focus on making sure that you are getting people to vote for candidates who are strong on climate. And if tabling doesn't happen to be your vibe, do some postcarding instead, like we've already highlighted. Our chapters in Wisconsin and Texas are leading the way on that. And our third strength is this: we view climate change for what it ultimately should be. It's a nonpartisan issue. And that means that our approach is fundamentally different from many other organizations. And we have worked hard to position ourselves as a convening space for people of different backgrounds and different political ideologies. I know that in an election year, our instincts can jump straight into endorsing a particular candidate or another all or nothing way of thinking, but that ultimately doesn't help us to move the conversation forward in the way that productive dialogue can. And as CCLers, we can host these dialogues. In fact, we've done this very thing successfully before, like how chapters in California's 16th Congressional District recently hosted a well-attended climate-focused candidate forum. You can read more and learn all about it on our CCL blog. And we don't lose anything by making the effort to facilitate an engaging conversation about climate with candidates from across the political spectrum. But we do stand to lose everything if we continue to perpetuate echo chambers. We break through them by staying curious, like we talked about earlier this morning. And the best part about all of these activities is that they have one simple unifying message, and that is this: government action on climate change is good for you. So, whether you're an elected official introducing legislation to bring new energy projects to your district, or a community member who is becoming gainfully employed by that energy transition, thoughtful climate action benefits all of us. And that relentless, grassroots, nonpartisan organizing that we've been doing for more than 15 years now has been changing the electorate. If we can amplify that to candidates through our participation in town halls and in meetings with them, we'll see more and more candidates coming to the table and having that climate plan we're looking for. So if you've been waiting for an invitation to join us in getting out the climate vote this year, consider today your official invite. We've been hard at work already, and we can always use more hands. A few opportunities to explore. Number one, student advocates from the higher education and national youth action teams have developed the Climate GOAT campaign. Climate GOAT. You might be wondering, what is a climate GOAT? Well, let me tell you, in this context, GOAT means greatest of all time. So we are mobilizing to be the climate vote and get out, or be the climate GOAT to get out the climate vote. And we're mobilizing students from middle school through grad school to have conversations with their peers and family about the importance of climate change as an election issue. We've heard all kinds of stories on how elected officials have had a change of heart towards climate after a conversation with their kids or grandkids. And what if we could replicate that on a national level? This is the campaign where we're finding it out, and we've already had over 270 conversations with our young adults across the country. So find out more. You can seek out myself or Sharon Bagatelle and go to cclusa.org/climategoat. We also have an amazing action team called the Election Engagement Action Team. They've been working hard all year and have developed some great resources for getting out the climate vote. You can find all of these on their action team page in CCL Community, including that social media kit, tabling materials, climate voter merch, and guidance for participating in climate events, as well as how you can get directly involved with EVP and sign up for those next opportunities for phone banking and postcarding. I encourage you, if you haven't yet, to click Join on the Election Engagement Action Team's page to get involved. And the action team has also been phone banking every single Wednesday since January 24th. That's 20 straight weeks. Raise your hand if you've had the chance to help out for one of those Wednesdays before looking out the room. Thank you. Thank you. We've already logged over 3,580 conversations, nearly 20,000 minutes, and we're going to continue to do that through October. So we look forward to seeing you there on Wednesday. And I'll just close by saying this. However you choose to engage, I hope that you will join us in getting out the climate vote this year by doing what CCLers do best. Being in our communities, respectfully spreading a nonpartisan message of the need for climate action. And now, with that, I am honored to welcome to the stage my incredible coworkers for an update on our policy roadmap for the year ahead. So please join me in welcoming Dana Nuccitelli, CCL's Research Coordinator, and Flannery Winchester, CCL's Senior Director of Communications. Thank you.
All right, welcome to our portion. We're going to talk about navigating CCL's 2024 policy roadmap. So, click the slide.
Hopefully we'll have some slides soon.
All right, we've got slides for you. They're great. I'll start off by just saying that whether you are brand new or whether you have been a volunteer for many years, hopefully it's clear to you that we work on policies to stop the pollution that's overheating the planet, right? That's our goal. And so Dana's going to get into the nitty-gritty here in a few minutes, but that's really the headline. So as a climate organization, that's our guiding principle for what we choose to support, the policy areas that we choose to engage in. We want to stop the pollution that's overheating the planet. So how are we going to do that exactly? Well, CCL believes that big national climate policy from Congress is the way to do it. And so we have a handful of major policy areas that we work in. And at the beginning of the year, we laid out this policy roadmap. If you were on our January national meeting, you might have seen it. So there are road signs all along the roadmap that point to activities that we're doing this year in each area. So you see there at the beginning, there's carbon pricing, permitting reform, healthy forests, electrification, and election season, which has been well covered by Brett and Nathaniel. So we are not going to go over election stuff anymore. But Dana's going to walk us through, for the next 20 minutes, he's going to walk us through the 4 policy areas. And then we'll pop back to this roadmap, and I'll show you the impact that we've been making so far this year in each of those areas already. And again, remember, Dana's just going to give us an overview. If you want to dive deeper, then there are breakout sessions all throughout the rest of the conference where you can really get into the details. So, all right, Dana, over to you.
Yeah, so let's do a quick overview of our 4 policy areas. We're going to start with carbon pricing, of course, because that's what we've been advocating for, putting a price on carbon pollution since CCL was born. Our carbon pricing advocacy is now almost old enough to vote itself, so it's nice and it's mature. So our preferred policy is, of course, a carbon fee and dividend, where we start by putting a price on the carbon pollution at its source, where the coal comes out of the mine or the oil and gas comes out of the well. And then our preferred approach takes that revenue, sends it all back to households in equally sized carbon cashback checks. And then our third leg of this stool is that we have a carbon border adjustment, where if American companies are paying for this carbon price and they export their stuff to countries that don't have a carbon price, then we refund that carbon fee at the border. Or if we're importing stuff from countries that don't have a carbon price to our country, then we apply the fee at the border so that everybody's on an equal playing field. This is important because we don't want to disadvantage American companies when we put the carbon price on. When we do a carbon border adjustment, we could potentially also take account of the carbon content of the products coming from the United States or other countries. The benefit there is that American companies already make relatively low carbon materials, and we're going to try to prove that with the Prove It Act, which you guys are going to advocate for in a couple of days here. So there are a lot of really good reasons to love this policy. First and foremost, when we put a price on carbon pollution, it creates the market incentive for innovation, for people to come up with clean, cheap, low-carbon solutions to replace our dirty fossil fuels. And then the carbon cash back puts money in our pockets, which for anybody with a relatively low carbon footprint, which especially includes almost all low and middle income households, they will then break even or come out ahead from that cash back payments. And as a bonus, that means that the policy will reduce income inequality and poverty as well. And then by reducing air pollution, we can let Americans live healthier, happier, longer lives. And really importantly, we have to get a carbon price to have a really good chance of meeting our Paris commitments of cutting our climate pollution 50% by 2030 and reaching net zero by 2050. There was just a really good paper that looked at that question, what policies can help us achieve those Paris commitments. And you can see some of their outcomes here. These are for climate policies that don't include a carbon price. And you can see in the red triangle there are Paris commitments. And you can see all these policies that don't include a carbon price come well short of meeting our Paris commitments. But then when they looked at policies that do include a carbon price, you can see they either come close or meet or exceed our Paris commitments. So that's a really important policy solution. The details, it depends on the details, but if you want to learn about those details, I have a breakout session tomorrow at 2:45 in Regency about post-IRA, or in the Empire Room, about post-IRA carbon pricing. Is that a pretty good shameless self-promotion of my event tomorrow?
All right, so back to the roadmap, this time with pins dropped all along the way, showing the milestones that we've achieved so far this year. So the pins in light green are the ones showing the impacts we've made specifically in the area of carbon pricing. So first, the Prove It Act that Dana mentioned. We've had some exciting movement so far. So the very first one you see here is this Senate Environment and Public Works Committee announced that they would mark up the Prove It Act in January. So we mobilized calls from volunteers in the 19 states of the senators on the committee, and our calls and engagement there actually helped this bill pass the Senate committee with even more bipartisan support than expected. So yeah, clap for that. And we continue to engage. So in March, we had a campaign to send messages to Congress. So we sent 8,747 messages urging co-sponsorship of the Prove It Act, so continuing to build support. And then we also have a mobilization this month around it. So we're asking volunteers to call, and they've placed 898 calls so far. We're aiming at 3,000. And of course, the Prove It Act is one of our primary asks for lobbying on Tuesday. So at least 432 of our confirmed lobby meetings we expect will be talking about the Prove It Act. And then one other carbon pricing related push that we did earlier this year was in May. We sent 9,574 messages to Congress sharing those findings that Dana was mentioning, the Hamilton and Brookings Institution research about how effective, how impactful a carbon price really would be. We sent these 9,000 plus messages to Congress, making sure that they have seen that research and that they know what a huge help it would be to meeting our climate goals. So we've really been keeping up the drumbeat on carbon pricing strong so far this year.
Totally. All right, so the next up we'll cover clean energy permitting reform. Which is really important. There was an analysis by these energy modelers at Princeton after the Inflation Reduction Act was passed that found that if we don't start building our clean energy infrastructure and especially our electrical transmission infrastructure faster, then we're only going to achieve about half of the potential emissions cuts from the Inflation Reduction Act and other climate policies that we've recently passed. So just some quick basics. What is a permit? A permit is an official authorization from a local or state or federal government to start the construction of a certain project. And that's a really important process because we want to make sure that we're protecting communities and workers and environments from the undue harm of operating and constructing those projects and that infrastructure. But getting a permit, it takes time, it takes money, and so you have to try to find the sweet spot where you're doing a thorough permitting process, but not taking so long that we're unduly delaying this rapid transition to a clean energy economy that we need to make. And so we're trying to get into that sweet spot. Right now, we're kind of erring on the side of taking too long to get our permits authorized. And so some ways to speed that up. We've done a few things so far. We got the bipartisan infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act passed. Those had some legal changes and some funding to help get some clean energy infrastructure built faster. There's also executive actions and rulemaking from federal agencies. We saw a bunch of recent rulemakings from federal agencies in the last couple of months, basically doing what they can to expedite the permitting process. So those have been really helpful. But by itself, that's not enough to kind of meet the speed and scale of the deployment of clean energy and the rapid permitting that we need to do. And so kind of the next thing that we can do is get Congress to pass some comprehensive bipartisan permitting reform, and that's where CCL comes in. That's what we'll be lobbying for again on Tuesday. So specifically, we're trying to get policies that add to our capacity to transmit clean electricity, which will also improve the security of our power grid, and to speed up the approval of the clean energy projects that are waiting in line to be built right now. And we also want to make sure we're preserving communities' ability to make their voices heard on the environmental and other impacts of energy projects in their communities. Because one concern is that if you speed up and expedite the permitting process, you might inadvertently cut out people's voices. And we want to make sure that we're not doing that.
All right, so permitting was our first major action of the year. We sent 11,476 messages to Congress. I should clarify, when I say we sent, y'all sent. This was the volunteers. So volunteers like you and everyone else back at home sent those messages in January asking for more bipartisan engagement or working on a bipartisan package for permitting reform. And then this was also the focus of our lobby meetings at our Conservative Climate Conference and Lobby Day in March. Their primary ask was for the Big Wires Act and other measures to speed up the clean energy permitting process. And of course, as Dana mentioned, on Tuesday is one of our other primary asks.
That's right. All right, so next up, we're going to talk about healthy forests, which is another great policy area. It's got a lot of potential to achieve significant carbon reductions as those trees grow and pull the carbon out of the atmosphere. So they can both mitigate the problem that way, and they can also help us to adapt and become more resilient, because we're seeing more and more of these extreme heat waves as a result of global warming, and trees provide some nice shade and other cooling benefits to help us become more resilient to those. So there's lots of potential co-benefits like that. There's also lots of good research on the physical and mental health benefits of being around trees. There's also lots of potential coalition partners, because lots of groups are working on tree and forest-related solutions, and lots of bipartisan support, because just about everybody loves trees. Yeah, woo. So far, right now, we've got lots of forests already in the United States, and those forests are moving about 12% of the greenhouse gases that we Americans put into the atmosphere every year by burning fossil fuels. We could almost double that number, increase it by about another 10% with some good forest policy solutions. And about half of that potential stems from reforestation, which is basically planting trees where there used to be forests a long time ago. And so this pie chart kind of illustrates why we're focusing specifically on healthy forests. This is the natural carbon removal that's happening right now in the United States. You can see almost three-quarters of it comes from existing forests, trees growing in our existing forests. Another 13% from trees growing in cities, 10% from reforestation, planting new trees and expanding our forests. So that's 97% of our natural carbon removal today is coming from forests, and then another 3% comes from farming. And then this chart shows the potential future carbon removal from natural sources in the United States. You can see all the green ones on the left are tree and forest-related solutions. The two big ones are forest management, which is when we harvest trees, trying to do it in a way that has less impact on the surrounding trees and the soils, so they can continue to retain their carbon. And then reforestation, again, which is planting more trees, for which the Seedlings Act that we're going to advocate for as a secondary ask is really important, because as Bob Ross would put it, we want lots of happy little trees growing up in our forests.
All right, so in February, we mobilized around the Farm Bill, which has a lot of climate funding and potential for related forestry policies in it. So y'all generated 11,329 messages to Congress in February about that climate smart funding. Also, the Increased TSP Access Act, which is something that we're watching that could be part of the Farm Bill, was a secondary ask at the Conservative Climate Conference and Lobby Day. And we saw after our volunteers were on the Hill, they lobbied on that in March, we saw one new conservative senator and a couple more House Republicans jump on as co-sponsors after our volunteers had these meetings and spoke to them about the Increased TSP Access Act. And then later in the spring, also that bill that Dana just mentioned, the Seedlings for Sustainable Habitat Restoration Act. That's something that we used as a secondary ask in last year's June Lobby Day. In the spring, we started to see a little bit of movement where that passed committee just a few weeks ago. So lots of different places to make impact there on the healthy forests area.
Absolutely. All right, so last but not least, we have building electrification and efficiency. So here we've gotten a lot done already when we got the Inflation Reduction Act passed, because that had lots of incentives for homeowners to electrify and make their homes more efficient. This is a nice illustration by an artist showing all of the different incentives for homeowners to make their homes more electrified and efficient. Things from space and water heat pumps to induction stoves to better insulation and solar panels and electric car charging and things like that. To learn about those, there's this great tool called the Rewiring America IRA Savings Calculator, which you can get to by going to this short URL here, cclusa.org/IRA-calc. And once you get there, you just put in your household information, and it will tell you all of the great incentives that you qualify for to electrify and make your home more energy efficient. And it'll tell you whether they're tax credits or rebates and how large they are, and so on and so forth. So it's a great tool to learn what your options are and to spread the word to everybody else you know, to make sure that people are taking advantage of these great and really important incentives. So that's the IRA. We have an electrification action team that's doing lots of great stuff, hosting lots of good workshops to educate people. They teamed up with our youth action team to do the Great School Electrification Challenge, where they're getting school districts all around the country to electrify their school buildings, having lots of great successes there. That's been a really good program. And then we're doing lots of state and local efforts to get electrification policies in place as well.
So, as Dana mentioned, Congress passed the Inflation Reduction Act, and so they are not currently doing much else on electrification. They've sort of checked that box. So that's why we haven't done a Congress-focused mobilization around electrification, but what we are planning for later in the year, for the month of August, is Electrification Month, where we'll be focused on outreach. So we're gonna have fresh tabling materials for you. Our chapters will be hard at work talking about these incentives and all sorts of ways that people can make this transition. And so stay tuned for Electrification Month in August.
Yeah, that's a good month. All right, so we're going to quickly just put this all into context in a graph because I cannot resist a good graph. And so here you can see our greenhouse gas emissions from the United States between 2005 and 2023 going down very slowly. In the dashed line at the bottom, you can see our Paris target of 50% cuts by 2030. Before the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, that was basically the path we were on there, headed for about 27% cuts by 2030, more than halfway short, or almost halfway short, of our Paris commitments. And so the IRA by itself will get us a few percent more, maybe to 31% cuts or so. And then if we can also spread the word about those electrification and weatherization opportunities, we can get a few more percentages out of the Inflation Reduction Act, it's about 33% cuts by 2030. And then if we can get clean energy permitting reform passed, maximize the potential of the Inflation Reduction Act, we can then get to 40% cuts by 2030. Then we're going to get a carbon price passed, get another 10% emissions cuts. That'll get us to 50%. A carbon price. And that gets us to our Paris commitment. But we're not going to stop there. We also still have the Healthy Forest Policy area. And that's going to pull maybe 5% more of our emissions out of the atmosphere, get us to 55% below 2005 by 2030, blow past our Paris targets. Set a good example for the rest of the world by not just meeting, but surpassing our Paris commitments. So it's an ambitious goal, but that's what we try to do. We try to be very ambitious here at CCL. Right, Flannery?
Absolutely. All right, so thank you. Let's give a big round of applause to Dana, who knows all the things. All right, so now we're going to hear from some of our volunteers about how they are bringing these policy areas to life. So I want to welcome to the stage Steffi Rausch from North Carolina, Izel Nira from Florida, and Brian Thornton from Nevada. We're going to hear a little bit from them. So, of course, we know we are always at all times working on carbon pricing. And so we've invited these folks here to talk a little bit about some of the other policy areas. And so, Steffi, you want to start off and tell us about your work on the Healthy Forests policy area?
Right. Okay, so this is working. In North Carolina, we have a very conservative area, and everyone loves a good farmer. They have an amazing way of making things very nonpartisan and talking in that way. We have farmers in our area that are very small farms and in the mountains, and they tend to do more regenerative ag techniques. Our representative was kind of tired of hearing about carbon pricing and wanted something new. And I had been trying to talk to farmers over the last few years, and it just seemed like a natural transition. He also tended to start up some kind of an ag board, and one of them was on it. And after talking to a few of them, they decided that they would go into a meeting with a representative in district, so we set that up. And amazingly, the 2 asks that we had for him in that meeting after them talking about their regenerative ag techniques, so it was very little time, not enough to talk about it, was number 1, would he join the Conservative Climate Caucus? And he did. And number 2, would he entertain getting out and coming to their farms for a farm tour? And he said yes. So with that, we set up the farm tour. It took several months to get there, but we did, and we went to 2 of the 5 farmers' farms. One had a major flooding event who I had called after that flood had happened. I'd seen it in the paper. The other was practicing agroforestry, which was really cool to see, and they did such a great job of explaining everything. He actually brought his top staffer. He brought a photographer. We had a photo op. I've never seen a representative go that far. He loved it. He learned a lot, and then he wrote afterwards on his newsletter and social media, of which we also then promoted too. And we asked him during the farm tour if he would co-sponsor the TSP Access Act, of which the farmers, only one really knew about that and had utilized it. The others did not, so it was really good for them to learn in the process. But he co-sponsored it, and we now are planning, hopefully if I have time, to get to writing an op-ed about what he did and thanking him for all of his efforts in that regard. So, yeah.
Awesome. All right, Isel, let's come to you to hear about what you've been up to on electrification.
Yes, thank you, Flannery. My name's Isel for everyone here, and I actually just graduated high school 3 weeks ago, but when I was in high school...
Congratulations.
Thank you. But when I was in high school, my senior year, I decided to start a climate action club. So I was hoping to get more young people involved in the fight for climate justice, and immediately we were super intrigued by the Great Electrification Challenge. So we kind of set that as a goal and started going at it. So initially, I thought it would be good to get a feel for how receptive the school board would be towards the idea of electrification. So I started out by reaching out to a younger school board member named Alexandra Ayala, and she connected me with representatives from the school board district. And so through that, I was able to organize for the representatives to come to my school during lunch, meet with my club, and we basically presented the idea of electrifying our cooling systems and our bus fleets. And to my surprise, they were actually super receptive. They were super happy to hear that we were trying to do that. But then they kind of eased me back in reality and told me that it wouldn't necessarily be possible for at least a couple of more years because of other logistical issues. So for example, there's currently a bus driver shortage, so they can't really prioritize electrifying buses until that issue is resolved. But they were super open to the ideas, and they were totally on our side and willing to collaborate. So their openness to that idea and their receptiveness kind of inspired me to try to find other alternative ways that we could increase sustainability around campus. So through that, because I had that contact with my school board member, Alexandra Ayala, I ended up meeting with her again in a virtual meeting to discuss other ways that we could increase sustainability on campus. And mainly the focus was on reducing waste because of the cafeteria system. The students were seeing that there's a lot of excessive waste and single-use plastics and a lot of styrofoam use and different things like that. So she showed her appreciation to us, and we really felt valued by her and everything. So after that, we decided to take it to the entire school board. So actually, during April in Earth Week, we went to a school board meeting, my team and I, and we all kind of spoke about different things, including how to reduce waste on campus and the different things. And then we also brought up again the longer term goal of electrification to try to get that in their heads once again. And afterwards, what ended up happening is that a month later, my school district committed to reducing plastic use on campuses by 25% in the upcoming school year. And they also committed to be entirely foam-free by 2025. And the last thing that they did is that they made a work order process so that we have different reusable like water bottle stations on campus. So they created a process, if any issues arise with those stations, they can report it to the district and get that fixed as soon as possible. And for context, Palm Beach County School District is the 10th largest district in the entire United States. So for them to take this step, for me, was really significant. And although ultimately we weren't able to immediately achieve electrification, I feel like the connections that we've been able to make with school board member Alexandra Ayala and the rest of the school board, I hope that we can keep building these relationships until one day electrification can be possible and we can keep taking these smaller steps towards progress as well.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that. All right, and Brian, let's hear what you've been up to in the area of permitting reform.
Well, it's more about what the state's been up to. Permitting reform has really done three things for us in Nevada. One is it's brought together the chapters to work together. I'll talk about that. It's helped us to rebuild and extend our relationship with Representative Amodei, and it has strengthened our relationship with the Reno-Sparks Chamber of Commerce. So in terms of the statewide support, we created a permitting team across the whole state, bringing the chapters together that has been meeting, and Michelle Hamilton, the state coordinator, started that, and then our former state coordinator, Wayne Willis, extended that and is continuing to lead that. And what it did was, as a group, we investigated what was going on with permitting reform in the state, and we actually discovered that in Nevada, there's been considerable progress, and things are moving in a pretty good direction. But that dialogue now continues with a regular communication about national permitting reform, and has brought, as I said, the chapters together. In terms of Representative Amodei, we had a strong relationship there that Midge Breeden built over a number of years, but towards the end of 2022, it kind of got stagnant. We couldn't go any further. We'd reached an impasse on carbon fee and dividend. There was support for carbon pricing, but not for the dividend. And so we actually had a period with no meetings. And then last year, as permitting reform got on our agenda, Tim McFerrin, the co-liaison, and I were able to kind of restart that dialogue, and permitting reform became a big part of that, because Representative Amodei is very interested in mining permitting reform, Nevada being a big mining state. And then he's also interested in geothermal, which is a resource that's important in Nevada and has great opportunity, as well as litigation reform, which is one of the 4 elements that we're going to be talking about in the lobbying this time. And so it really has generated a new dialogue and a new opportunity to talk with our representative. Related to that, we also have a relationship with the Reno-Sparks Chamber of Commerce, and we again had not been able to go very far with CF&D. They weren't willing to commit to that or endorse it or write letters, but permitting reform seemed to be a little closer to the core of their policy interests. And so I was able to get the CEO of the Reno-Sparks Chamber of Commerce to participate in the letter writing campaign that we're doing for the current lobbying effort. And she wrote letters to our congresspeople, including Representative Amodei, who's in District 2, our district. And so we're going to be able to highlight those letters here on Tuesday. And we hope in particular that that will help, again, strengthen the relationship with Amodei. So not only is it helping our relationship with the Reno-Sparks Chamber of Commerce, but again, will strengthen our relationship with our legislators. So.
Incredible.
So it's been a good opportunity for us in Nevada.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, what I'm struck by hearing all 3 of your stories is just that how much the new policy areas are opening up new pathways and new creative ways to build momentum and really make positive change. So one more round of applause for our volunteers. So unfortunately, we don't have time for questions, but again, if you want to dive deeper into any of these policy areas, find the relevant breakout, and you'll have plenty of time to ask questions there. I think that is it for now. We have a 10-minute break coming up, yes, 10-minute break. And so one more round of applause for our volunteers, and then we'll see you back in this room. Okay.
Thank you.
Members of Congress want to know what voters want. Nothing is more impactful than citizens meeting frequently with their members of Congress or their staff. Congress places a high value on groups and citizens who have built relationships with the legislator and staff.
Some of our members of our chapter have known our members of Congress for decades, and I think that has helped really connect with our members of Congress. We see them and know them as human beings, as well as these legislators who can lead the way and lead the path of climate action.
I did develop a very good relationship with the Energy and Environmental Aid to Representative Crenshaw, which, we became actually pretty good friends.
So Citizens Climate Lobby volunteers, regular, everyday grassroots people, meet with their members of Congress often in order to build a strong relationship with open dialogue.
What I love about CCL is that it really goes to how are laws made, how are policies created, and how do we get in front of them and talk to our legislators so that we can actually educate them about carbon fee and dividend and help them find a way to creating policy.
You'd be surprised the kinds of relationships you can build with people and the kind of conversations you can have and the information you can gather when you just try. When you engage with them as people, you treat them with respect and you ask them questions, getting to know them, getting to know their goals, and kind of seeing from the beginning how we can work together.
Relationship building means taking the most generous approach to other people as possible. Appreciation, gratitude, and respect. We listen, we work to find common ground, and we build the political will for lasting change. Over time, we've built quite a name for ourselves on Capitol Hill.
I tell you, I love Citizens Climate Lobby. You guys are the best. There is no better environmental group.
One of the reasons I'm here, one of the reasons that I've been able to do what I do is because of my relationship in Utah with CCL.
Now, this is not a problem that we can solve in Congress on our own, so I'm so thankful for the work of Citizens Climate Lobby.
We show Congress that the climate legislation we want passed is something their constituents want and educate them on how these bills will impact their state or district. Learn more and get involved at cclusa.org/join.
What I'm about to tell you might change your entire view on politics. Are you ready? Okay, so it doesn't actually take boatloads of money or years of training to be a lobbyist. In reality, lobbying is just building strong relationships, and you, as a regular, engaged citizen, can totally do it. Successful lobbyists, whether they are a paid professional or a passionate citizen, develop relationships and drive change they want to see.
You hear stories from CCL members who, through perseverance and taking on CCL's mission, have changed the minds of their members of Congress. It is possible. There are ways to really connect with different members of Congress in order to move them forward.
We have advantages as citizen lobbyists. Some state associations, nonprofits, and corporate leaders may offer numbers and data, but they can't pair it with a personal story that centers the human experience of an issue and why it matters to you and your family.
The way that I tried to build a relationship with Representative Crenshaw's aide was first I had a one-on-one face-to-face meeting with her. Though the thing that really cemented our relationship was I had a newborn grandchild, and I sent her a picture, this is why I'm interested in climate change, or some sort of message like that. And she just thought that was adorable and great. From then on, every time we had any kind of interaction, she would ask, how's Violet doing? You got any pictures? So I would have to send her more pictures. It was a very endearing relationship, and I think that really had a positive impact on her.
What's important for us to remember as citizens is that we can reclaim the soul of citizenship. We know that politicians don't create political will, they respond to it. And that it's our job as citizens to create so much political will that politicians have no other choice than to do what we ask of them.
We got 500 letters written, and we combined those letters with a bunch of other letters from around the Chicago area that chapters had raised. We paid a visit to Senator Durbin, and Senator Durbin had rarely
good to see everybody. You know what? I don't think I will ever get used to those lights. There's just no way. Can we get our mics on? Is it on? Okay. No, I don't think we'll ever get used to those lights. It is jarring, but it's worth it because this is what we all work for. This lobby day is when we come to DC and we really make our voices heard. It's not working. I'm saying such good stuff right now. Why don't you talk, Jim, while I fix this?
All right. Well, you guys can hear me loud and clear, I think. All right, perfect. I'll just take over. You can leave if you want, Ben. We don't know. No, I'm thrilled to be here, largely because it's so nice to reconnect with all of you. It's so great to see everyone back in person, another year, and new faces, so many new young faces too. It's so exciting to have you here. And I'm also excited because being in person, lobbying in person, is, I think, the most influential thing we can do. You know, we do a lot throughout the year. Flannery and Dana went through all of the phone calls, the emails, the actions you guys have taken, and those definitely have a huge impact. But when I was on the Hill, and I know Ben has similar stories, my member would have 15, 20 meetings a day, running all around the Hill, talking to a bunch of people. At the end of the night, when I was packing up, getting ready to go home, the things that he would talk to me about were not the meetings with leadership or committees or the different organizations that came in. It would be the constituent that came in that happens to live in the next town over, or the 30-minute conversation he got to talk to a constituent about the local hockey team and how they blew it last night. A lot of sports talk in my office. But those were the conversations that stood out to him. And he didn't even always remember the policy that they came in to advocate for, but he would tell me, you know, that guy who likes the hockey team, make sure you look into what he came in to talk about. So, one, that goes to the power of staff, right? Congressional staff. But two, that's what stood out to him. Those connections, being able to talk to constituents, talk to people that live in their community that are facing the same challenges, know the same school districts, the same stores, they've got the same perspective on so much because they live close together. Those things really stand out. So I can't overstate how critical it is that you guys are here in person having these conversations. They go so far to sticking in a member of Congress's head and congressional staff's head, and I think really take our asks and just make them so much more effective. And on top of that, the fact that we show up in these numbers, I can't believe, I think we're at 434, 435 meetings. It's amazing, it's astounding how many meetings we have, and that level of force, that level of impact we have on the Hill because the numbers we show up in really resonates. So you're having an impact just by sitting down and talking to your member person to person or congressional staff face to face. But then when you're in the hallways, we're swarming the buildings, it feels like. Staff see it and members of Congress see it, and it goes noticed. And it shows that you're not just one person from your community or 5 people from your town. We're 1,000+ strong here in person doing this together, and that really, really elevates what we're doing and takes it to a whole different level, makes us so much more effective. So I'm just so excited, and I really, really appreciate everyone coming out and coming down to DC.
I like your excitement. All right, now this works. And to follow up on what Jen was saying, one thing I really want to get across is in some ways, just you being here is the message. What Jen was talking about, the numbers and things, you don't understand, there aren't many fly-ins that are this big. There are not many fly-ins that people on their own dime decide to come into DC because they want to advocate for something. A lot of times it's in context of with a union or the Airline Pilots Association or something where they're like coming as part of work and just being here, going through the effort to say like, I am a climate advocate that's concerned enough to come to DC is sending a message. This is one time we kind of talk about, you don't have to know all the policy details of permitting reform, because just the simple act of you coming to Congress and saying this is something important to lower emissions, that is the message we're trying to get across, not whether or not something should be 9 months or 12 months. That momentum is what we're trying to build, and that is your greatest value being here in person this week. And we really appreciate it. And with that, I think we're going to get to just a quick review of our asks. Like I say, when I say you guys don't need to be experts in everything, we're not experts in anything either. So we also have a special guest who's a lot more eloquent than I am, maybe even more eloquent than Jen, but I don't know. But we'll see, and we'll get to Zan here shortly. But let's just do a quick review of the asks that you guys will make tomorrow.
All right, so we've got some slides coming up, and yeah, so on Tuesday there will be two primary asks, and these are co-primary asks. One is the Prove It Act, which has a Senate bill of S 1863. There is a forthcoming House bill, hopefully in the next few weeks, and then bipartisan comprehensive permitting reform will be the other co-primary ask. And I'll start diving into just a little bit the Prove It Act. And this bill, hopefully you guys are familiar with, you've seen our trainings, but there was a deep dive in case you haven't seen it. It requires the Department of Energy to study and come up with the facts surrounding the emissions intensity of US produced products from certain industries. So there's certain products laid out in the bill, thinking of things like cement, aluminum, oil, fertilizer, things that are pretty emissions intensive. And it requires DOE to study those things, figure out how emissions intense they are from the US, as well as from some other countries. So some of the countries that are our competitors, like China, India, that we think don't have as clean industry, also some of our allies as well. So that's the basics of what this bill does. It's requiring them to get this data and to study it.
And just remember, once again, I mean, referring back to our trainings, I know you want to think about further in the future how to improve it, but really important with this bill, it's super important to focus only on what it does. It provides that information, and that alone is good enough. It's information we need to have, and so let's just focus on what it does. And with House Republicans and Democrats, one of the reasons we have Prove It as an ask is we have an opportunity right now. The bill is going to be introduced in the House in the next couple of weeks. One of the best ways you can have a bill have success is for a large original co-sponsor list. The second it's introduced, there's a certain number of Republicans and a certain number of Democrats, and just coming right out of the gate with those numbers makes it easier to move a bill and gain momentum. And so this is a really good opportunity to add to that original co-sponsor list. So in the House, ask Republicans and Democrats to be original co-sponsors when the bill is introduced.
Yeah, and in the Senate, we've already got a bill out there, so the ask for Senate Republicans is to co-sponsor that bill. In the Senate, they're trying to keep that co-sponsor list pretty even, and this is a harder bill for Republicans to co-sponsor than for Democrats. So for Republicans, we want them to co-sponsor. For Senate Democrats, the ask is for them to talk to their leadership and urge them to move the bill. The bill has already moved out of Senate committee, so it could go to the Senate floor. That's the ask for Democrats. Go make that appeal to Senate leadership. And I'll also say on the Prove It Act, I know we've had some discussion already today on the fact that, you know, we're thinking and we're talking about these large climate solutions. We want these huge emissions reductions, and certainly with something like permitting reform, Dana already showed us how quickly that will drop that down. This bill is going to give us data, right? It's not going to result, this bill specifically, in any direct emissions reductions. But the reason this is so important, this bill specifically, is the policy is important. We do need this data. Our trade representatives need this data going into conversations with countries like China and India. When we talk about global emissions, we have to have concrete data points to go on. And secondly, and I think most importantly, is that we've got to build our climate coalition. This bill is being led by and has so much Republican support. It passed out of committee in the Senate, a climate bill, an emissions bill, passed out of the Senate committee. That speaks volumes. So even though this policy might not be the largest, most impactful thing in our minds right now, it's moving, it has tremendous momentum, and we're bringing so many new people into the fold, so many conservative voices and Democratic voices to the table with this bill. It's helping us build our coalition of members of Congress, also of industry, also of other groups who don't normally engage on emissions or climate. This bill is bringing those people in. We've got a good list of supporting organizations online and in the one-pager that you can point to. So thinking beyond just the specific policy of this, the hope of this bill and what we're already seeing come to fruition is that we're getting more people to come into the climate fold so that we can use this group that we're forming to do bigger things down the road.
All right, let's talk permitting reform. I really like this quote that came out the other day. The climate movement must recognize that its primary target is no longer just big oil. It's the regulatory barriers that keep clean energy from getting built and delivered efficiently to American homes. This was from Brian Deese, who is former director of the White House Economic Council under President Biden. And this is the thing we're trying to get across. Permitting reform is going to be key to all our emissions reductions goals. You cannot take any fossil fuel infrastructure offline unless you replace it with something else, and right now it simply takes too long to do that. That's why we've had a couple things get done that we've advocated for. Some of the rules that we talked about earlier with FERC and CEQ and DOE and some of the trains might allow transmission to be built faster. Some things will reduce the time to complete environmental reviews. We're avoiding some duplicative processes and designated lead agency. We're ensuring robust and early community engagement. But there's a lot of stuff that isn't done. Judicial review hasn't been done. Interregional planning and transmission hasn't been done. Minimum transfer requirements like were contained in big wires have not been part of any packages passed or any rule. And all the technology-specific stuff out there, nuclear, hydro, geothermal stuff that does need to be done for those technologies to come online in a big way has yet to be accomplished. So the top line message we want you to have tomorrow, and you have the one-pager, is Congress still needs to take action on comprehensive permitting reform package. Only Congress can do it. The agencies can't do it. FERC can't do it. Congress has to do it. And this Congress, there is an opportunity. There are bipartisan negotiations ongoing. But we want to provide that momentum, that incentive to keep the conversation going, to get something done now. And with that, we'll just do a quick review of the secondary asks.
Yeah, so before I get into our exact secondary asks, I want to back up and talk about why these secondary asks, because you guys have a lot on your plate with those two co-primary asks. I know those are not small topics to cover. So first I want to say, if you're worried about timing in your meetings, you want to get through those primary asks. Those are the priority, prove it and permitting reform. If you've got time after, then look at these secondary asks. Maybe pick one if you think you only have time for one. Don't hesitate to leave behind a one-pager of a secondary ask, even if you haven't been able to cover it. But we picked these two secondary asks because they have momentum. So both of these bills have already started to move. The two bills we're focusing on is the Increased Technical Service Provider Access Act of 2023. You guys have already lobbied on this. We've gotten a ton of momentum behind it, a lot of co-sponsors, and we saw this included in the House-introduced Republican, I should say, Farm Bill that has moved out of the Republican-led Agriculture Committee in the House. So we've already seen movement of this. And then also the Seedlings for Sustainable Habitat Restoration Act. And this bill also was marked up and moved through the Natural Resources Committee. So both of these bills, because of the advocacy you guys have done, the momentum behind them, they're starting to move. Now these are both plays for the Farm Bill. So we have a Farm Bill session coming up tomorrow. Tune into that and you'll learn more about where the Farm Bill stands. But our goal right now is to build a little more support for these, get more co-sponsors on the bill, so that way when the Farm Bill does start to move and there is movement, these can slide through.
With that, I wanted to bring up Zan Fishman. You know, Zan is Senior Director of Policy of the Energy Policy Department at the Bipartisan Policy Center. He is seriously one of the smartest people working in Washington today. We have come to rely on him extensively. The Bipartisan Policy Center has become a great convening force to bring people together to talk about some of these issues, and Zan has led those efforts. We participated in them when we think about what permitting policies need to get accomplished. And before that, Zan was congressional staff. Unfortunately, he was House staff, so he just lowered the discourse on this stage just a little bit by coming up here. But he was with our good friend Congressman Delaney, who is, of course, a great champion of the Bipartisan House Climate Caucus and the Energy Innovation Act and carbon pricing, and just a great bipartisan leader. And we're really happy that Zan joined us up here to probably make us look bad. Yeah, that's great.
Thank you for having me.
Jen, do you want to lead off with the first question for Zan?
I can kick it off as a former House staffer, kick it off with a great question because of my background as House staffer.
The People's House.
Can you talk to us, I guess, before we dive into the weeds on permitting, because I'm sure everyone wants to talk about specifics, just why permitting? Why is that
so important right now as a climate ask? Why is that the thing we should be focusing on? What does it mean in terms of efficacy and really seeing some impact here with climate?
Well, you know, it's about bureaucracy. And that's what everybody loves to talk about, right? It's the exciting thing. You know, you grow up, you go to school, you're like, I really want to focus my life on bureaucracy. Building stuff is hard. It's really hard for a lot of reasons. You got to get the money to be able to build it. You got to get the people who are able to plan it. It's very technical. You got to find the location. You got to figure out how it connects to everything else. You got to make sure that you've got a long-term business plan, and you got to get the permits. And one of the key differences between actually completing a project that you want to do and failing to complete a project, historically in the US over the past several decades, has been whether or not you're able to get your permits in a timely manner. And historically, the answer for many projects has been no. Like our permitting process, it's bad. It's not good. We've made some improvements. It's less bad than it was last time I was here talking to you. But we've made like 20% of the improvements that we need. So good, positive step forward, still a lot to do. But you know, if it takes 4.5 years to get your permits, and then for up to 6 years after that, your permit can get sued because of a deficiency in the permit. Not because of a deficiency in the project. Not because of the project doing something bad or polluting, but a deficiency in the permit that the administration did. For up to 6 years, it can get sued. And then there could be an injunction to stop the project that could last forever, over and over again. You don't have certainty. And not that anything's certain in life, but you know, you need a degree of certainty to be able to devote $1 billion of capital for the kinds of projects that we're talking about that we need for clean energy, right? It's not chump change. And so we're talking about bureaucracy.
Well, I think that's a good point too. And when I was talking about, you know, you guys are the message by being here, this stuff is boring. People don't want to talk about it.
This is the message. This is right. Yes.
Other groups are not, there's not grassroots passion to talk about permitting reform. They want to do something shiny, but sometimes the dullest thing is the most important thing. And that's what we ought to keep that in mind all the time. And Suzanne, you said, I think one thing that is like, just think about that chart that Dana had up there, and we're thinking about 2030. That's 6 years away. So if you think about a permitting process that just went through like that was just 10 years, and that we're going to miss those targets. Like there's just no way around it. That's why this is the most timely thing right now that we're focused on, because we are up against the clock. We know there's a possible opportunity for a bipartisan package.
Yes.
It is hard to get that agreement, and it might be on a timeline that we don't love because it could stretch throughout this Congress. But I want you to talk a little bit, Zan, like, we know there's going to be good stuff in there for emissions reductions and build that. We know there's going to probably be some stuff in there that we don't love. Can you talk a little bit about why that package, when we see the entirety of it, just kind of theorizing what's going to be in it, why it's worth it even with some of the stuff we might not love, and what those things could be?
Sure. And I'll just back up a step. I work at the Bipartisan Policy Center, right? Our job, I'm on the energy program. Our job is to find things within the context of energy policy that are good policy and can be bipartisan. And that, you know, narrows our scope. It can be challenging, but it's very possible. But it's also the case that bipartisan policymaking requires compromise, right? The Democrats typically don't get everything they want in their bill. The Republicans typically don't get everything they want in their bill. But they find something that they can agree on, that's positive, that everybody gets something good. And that's the goal. And you know, sometimes there are purists out there that are like, no, I don't like that. I don't like compromising. I only like my thing exactly the way I want it. And that's great if you don't want to accomplish anything, right? Yeah, if you don't want your bill to pass Congress, then that's a great opinion to have. But if you do want to make progress, finding that bipartisan compromise is a necessary step. So permitting reform. It is almost inherently bipartisan for a couple of reasons. Now, step back decades ago, and if you were paying attention then, Republicans were pushing this message for a long time. Like, we need permitting reform. It takes too long to build things in our country, too much red tape, too much bureaucracy. It makes everything more expensive, right? Not just for the project developers, but for consumers, customers, right? People, like, everybody uses energy. Like, energy is really good. It makes our lives great, right? Right? You all got here using energy somehow. I don't know, right? You drove a car, you took public transit, you were on a plane. I'm not sure. You have refrigeration in your house, your food doesn't spoil. Energy is amazing. It's terrific. And we don't want it to be too expensive. If it's too expensive, then that's really bad. The cheaper energy is, like, the better our quality of life. Climate change, also really bad, right? Emissions are bad, and for a long time, energy has produced a lot of CO2 emissions. So the goal is to figure out how can we reduce the emissions, but increase the quality of life, right? We want energy costs to go down. We want emissions to also go down. Now, there are ways to make emissions go down without dealing with energy prices, right? And those usually end up with lower quality of life, right? We don't like that. There are ways to make energy costs go down without making emissions go down, and that's bad also. Permitting reform is one of those rare things we can do that actually fixes both problems at the same time. We can get cheaper energy and reduced emissions. And so this thing that Republicans have been pushing for a long time, now all of a sudden, because we're building clean energy, which we weren't doing 20 years ago, now that we're building clean energy, Democrats, especially the ones who are very climate focused, have something to get from the same policy solution, right? So all of a sudden, we can reduce energy costs and reduce emissions. That's why permitting reform is so important. That's why it can be bipartisan. That's why right now, Senator Manchin and the Democrats on the Energy Committee, and Senator Barrasso and the Republicans on the Energy Committee are trying to hash out a deal. And I'm really optimistic that they're going to get there.
We are too. We're definitely feeling optimistic. But as we go into Tuesday and all of us walk into those different offices on permitting reform, our top ask is, of course, let's get something done, a bipartisan deal. What messages specifically, I guess top line, for a Democratic office or a Republican office, each one, what different messages do you think are going to resonate right now with them on permitting reform?
I mean, honestly, like, from a top line perspective, it's what I just said. Cheaper energy, lower emissions, same policy tool, right? It's good for everybody. If you're talking to Democrats who are, like, really into clean energy and they're, like, excited about the fact that we just did a bunch for the Inflation Reduction Act, got these clean energy tax credits, you might want to say, we're not going to use a whole lot of those clean energy tax credits if we don't build the projects that use them, right? Right now, permitting is really holding them up, particularly transmission. Republicans might not be as excited about the Inflation Reduction Act in general, right? That was
just a little bit not excited.
That was a partisan bill, and even though the clean energy tax credits themselves were mostly bipartisan, and it's worth taking like 30 seconds to explain that, right? The Inflation Reduction Act, if you're a climate nerd, you think of it as like this big climate bill, but it was actually a much bigger bill, right? There was corporate tax changes, there were healthcare changes. It was a much bigger bill, and there were lots of reasons for Republicans to oppose that bill that were unrelated to the clean energy tax credits. Because most of those clean energy tax credits actually are bipartisan in nature.
I think it's worth pointing out there that actually just as we speak the last couple of weeks, there have been several Republicans that have come out and said they do not want to take a sledgehammer to the IRA, particularly like the clean energy tax credits. There is support for keeping those bipartisan support, and we'll probably need to build on that depending on what the election brings us in November. Well, I don't know. Are no cards going around? I just want to make sure we have no cards going around because we will reserve some time for your questions as well. So if you guys look out for those, we will keep a little bit of time. I do want to pivot. And we got real lucky with Zan. I had a plan. It just so happens Zan's not just an expert on permitting, but also climate and trade. And in particular, has been working on the Prove It Act. So we got kind of a twofer here where we can address both of our asks and really like to get into Prove It with you and explain to us why Prove It on its own merits is worth passing this Congress, and take us down that road a little bit.
Yeah, so the climate and trade space is really interesting. It's really interesting. It's got this amazing bipartisan potential because there are people who think about it from a climate angle. There are people who think about it from a domestic manufacturing angle. There are people who think about it from an anti-China geopolitical angle. And there are people who think about it from a secure supply chains angle. And those are all really important. And there's different constituencies who focus more and less on different pieces of that. But all of those together are why it's able to be a really bipartisan issue. And it happens to be the case that in the United States of America, we produce products, on average, cleaner than the rest of the world. And that's amazing. Like, we're starting from a really great place, right? Our friends over at the Climate Leadership Council, they call it our carbon advantage, right? We produce stuff generally, on average, 40% cleaner than the rest of the world. And if you compare it to China, 2 to 3x cleaner. So the Prove It Act is just a data bill, right? You explained that earlier. You were very right about that. It's just getting the data. What is our average product emissions for different products compared to our trading partners and competitors? Why is that useful? Just knowing the data. A few reasons. One is we could use it in trade negotiations. Another is that the EU has passed a CBAM, a Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. And starting in just a couple of years, exports from the United States into the EU will start facing a tariff, a fee, based on their carbon emissions. And the thing that is often not thought about in policies like that is how do you calculate those emissions, right? And everyone's like, oh yeah, you just count up the CO2 molecules. It's just math, right? And math is math, and that's great, but variables are variable. And the formulas and the calculations you use to figure out the emissions intensity really matter. And it just happens to be the case that the EU and the US don't always agree on those kinds of things. And so if you're a Republican and you're thinking about the fact that EU's about to start hitting US imports into the EU, US exports away from us with a tariff, you're like, well, we want to have our math to show that our stuff is in fact the cleanest, rather than relying on their math, which we think that they may have devised in such a way to, favor their goods over ours, right? We wouldn't want that scenario. So that's why Republicans, I think, are really interested in it. I'll stop there for the moment, but I can keep going.
I know you can.
Well, I want to dig in a little bit deeper on the CBAM issue, because we've been talking a lot about messaging on Prove It, and I know, we obviously have advocated for a long time for a bunch of different climate policies, including the carbon price and CBAMs. And with this bill, we're really advocating for exactly what this bill does, just for the data. And part of that is we're hearing some opposition from some Republicans in regards to anything CBAM related.
Right.
So can you talk to us a little bit about where that opposition is coming from,
sure.
or what?
You guys are going to love this. Yeah. So there are people out there who are opposing the Prove It Act because they say that the Prove It Act is going to be the first step to a carbon border adjustment, which the WTO will then find not compatible with the WTO, which will make them force the US to have a carbon tax. Now I know the end results of that might sound nice to people in this room. It sounds very not nice to most Republicans. And so they're using it as a scare tactic to get people not to support the Prove It Act. And let's just like go down the list of the reasons why that argument is kind of silly, right? This data will definitely lead to a border carbon adjustment in the US. No, Maybe it will, I don't know, but Congress is going to have to pass a bill, right? If Congress passes a separate bill that does that separate thing, we can debate that separate thing. But having this data is not going to get us the next step to having the bill, right? Secondly, I think they're wrong that it would be WTO incompatible. If you look at our friends again at the Climate Leadership Council have put out a paper on this showing several different arguments for why it could be WTO compatible. And the truth is we don't know, right? There is no WTO compatible list of things one can do, right? You pass a bill and you have an argument for why you think it works, and then someone will, file an objection at the WTO and say we can't do this, and then the WTO has to rule on that. And then historically the WTO doesn't do anything. And that's kind of how it's been working, right? So the fact that the WTO would even say anything about it or have an enforcement mechanism is probably not going to happen. And then lastly, the WTO could not wave a magic wand and slap a carbon tax on the United States. Again, Congress would have to do that, right? None of the arguments make sense. And lastly, they argue that the Prove It Act data is what we need for a national carbon tax. And it's simply the wrong data, right? We already have and we already collect all the data we need for a domestic carbon tax if we wanted to do that. It's not complicated data, right? You don't need product level emissions at each facility in order to do a carbon tax, right? You do it upstream. You all know this better than most, right? So it's the wrong data. So all the arguments don't make sense. And it's just a data bill, and it's just the data bill. It'll give us really good transparency. It'll show that our stuff is cleaner. It'll help us in trade negotiations. It'll help us deal with the EU. But it's nothing more than it is.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting when you look at the support on the Senate side. I mean, clearly, Senator Loomis, Senator Cassidy, Senator Coons all support the Prove It Act, and I think they all do it for a different reason.
Right.
And you don't get policies like that almost is in the eye of the beholder, and there's something you like about it. And we want to make sure that analogy I had on earlier training, you want to lead with what is most attractive to your audience. You don't want to sell a Republican senator on the thing that you're most excited about. You want to sell them on what they will probably be most excited about. And the same thing with Democrats on this bill. And I think there is really, we'll get your take on that. I think there's an opportunity to move this. I think a few more Republican co-sponsors, and I think we could really see movement this Congress, and that would be a really positive first step. And it intrigues me how desperate the opposition seems to stop it. I mean, for something that is a data bill, and so that makes me think we really should pass this bill. just saying, just speculate.
Well, if you really like cheap goods from China that are produced with a whole bunch of coal power that are really emissions intensive, and you think that's a good thing, then you might not like this bill, right? You might not like shining a spotlight on the fact that our stuff is a lot cleaner. But if you like making stuff in the US, if you like knowing where the emissions are coming from in trade flows, maybe it's good to have this data. And I agree with you. I just want to double down on something you said, right? A lot of the supporters of the Prove It Act are anti-carbon tax. And a lot of the supporters of the Prove It Act are pro-carbon tax. And the Prove It Act is neutral. It has nothing to do with a carbon tax, right? We should just be clear about that, right? And it's okay, right? You can go and talk to Democrats about the Prove It Act, and if they're a carbon tax friendly office, that's a thing you could talk about. But if you're going to a Republican office and they're anti-carbon tax, you might not want to talk about that in relation to the Prove It Act, because the Prove It Act is not connected to a carbon tax.
Yeah, I think it's good to remember too is some of the supporters of the Prove It Act. I know when they've been talking about it, it's been really interesting because Senator Kramer will say he was in a different place 4 years ago. And he has come around to this way of thinking, and so does people like Senator Cassidy. So people's positions, as they learn more about this stuff, do evolve. And now, Senator Kramer's all in on this and really wants to get this done. But I think now we probably can open up to some really hard questions. Maybe go easy on us, and Zan. Unless, Jen, you had anything else you wanted to throw in.
No, let's kick it to you guys. Do you have some audience questions?
All right, so we have lots of questions about verification. So how do other countries report on their emissions? How can we be sure that that is accurate? What happens if their assessment of their emissions differs from our assessment? How can we verify? So I have a whole stack of these.
Yeah. So basically, you need transparency around it. And we should think of it in kind of two separate buckets. There's the people who we think we can work with, and where we can come up with interoperable systems, where we have data that's transparent, like this is our methodology, this is how we show we're doing what we're doing. And with those, you got to figure out a harmonized system. It doesn't have to be the same system. It has to be harmonized and interoperable. Different countries work different ways. There are going to be other countries where we probably aren't going to trust them at all. And verification might not be an option, because transparency won't be an option. China might be one of those countries. In those scenarios, you kind of have to just make assumptions that they're probably polluting a lot, and not really give them a lot of the benefit of the doubt. And that's kind of how you deal with the two separate buckets. Lastly, I'll just say verification of all of these things is going to require a whole new workforce and systems that doesn't really exist yet. And earlier we talked about bureaucracy, state capacity, like just the ability to have people who know what they're doing, who are tasked with doing the things and have been trained to do those things, is actually really quite important. And so if we're going to start measuring product level data and think about it in trade flows, we're going to need a workforce capacity that is ready to do those sorts of things. MRV is a thing that you'll see throughout the climate space, in particular in things like carbon removal, measuring, monitoring, reporting, and verifying. MMRV, sometimes people call it. And we're really going to need to focus on that piece of it. It's a really good question.
Well, I think, and also, I could be wrong. I think Zan tells me I'm wrong at least once a conversation, pretty sure. But that's also the point of the Prove It Act. We're not we're getting our own data, even on these other countries, so we don't have to worry about the verification problem and whether or not the data they're sharing with us is accurate. We're saying these are our numbers, this is where we think you are, and we don't need to verify it. Would you say that's correct?
It's like half correct.
Half, I'll take it.
Like, with the Prove It Act, we will work with other countries to get the data. And it's not that we're going to send a SWAT team to France to measure their data. We are going to work with our allies in just like a normal way that we would. But at the same time, for countries that aren't going to work with us, we have various technologies that we can use to come up with estimates. And we can just be very conservative with what those estimates are and not give them the benefit of the doubt on anything.
Yeah. Great. We can do another question.
All right. We have questions about how much will the data collection cost for Prove It, and how will that be funded?
I don't know the answer to that. It's not going to be that much. It's important to fund, things that you ask the administration to do, but it's not going to be a vastly expensive thing. I don't have a number for you.
And I'll just reiterate here to one of our first points, you guys don't have to be experts on this stuff. So, when I was a congressional staffer, I'd be meeting with constituents. Some of those questions would pop into my mind. What would this cost? How, is this going to go through the appropriations process? Will DOE need more money to do it? But those are questions I would turn to someone like Zan to ask. So I'm sure after your meetings, BPC will get some outreach. You guys are not responsible for some of those kind of nitty-gritty in the weeds answers. And if you do get those questions, you can feel free to follow up after the fact. So don't feel too overburdened going into these meetings that you have to know every specific detail, because you certainly don't.
Yeah, and we can save some really hard questions for Dave Banks tomorrow.
Exactly.
Yeah,
give him the hardest ones.
You can point out which ones you want us to give Dave to really throw him some curveballs.
Good.
That could be fun.
All right.
We'll probably record it and you can watch it.
Perfect. I'll just sit in the audience.
All right, we also got a few questions about specifically limiting judicial review. So can we just go back over what exactly does that encompass? And then We had a couple questions about why would a progressive Democratic member of Congress want to support something like that when often that judicial review process is something built in to protect frontline communities?
Really terrific question, and there's a lot there. I could talk for an hour on this topic. And to answer the last question first, why should a progressive person want to think about judicial review? The answer is this. If you look at all of the infrastructure projects over the past, I forget how many years, 10-ish years, something like that, and you look at the rates at which they're sued, their permits are sued. You got pipeline projects, you got carbon capture projects, highways, wind, solar, utility scale solar, gets sued at the highest rate of all of the project types. So why should somebody who cares about climate care about judicial review? That's why. Solar gets sued, wind gets sued, and transmission lines get sued. And so the real question is, how do you develop a system that's fair, that makes sense, right? Because protecting communities is really important, right? And I want to be clear, when we're talking about judicial review, we're not talking about the ability of a community that gets harmed to sue, right? Like if some project dumps sludge into a lake, you can sue, right? Nobody is suggesting we're going to change that and have them not being able to sue. We're not talking about a violation of the Clean Water Act. We're not going to try to change that. We're not talking about a violation of the Clean Air Act. We're not trying to change that. What we're talking about is suing the permit to start building. The administration goes through 2 years to write this long permit and evaluate, is this going to cause environmental effects? And they're going to evaluate a whole bunch of things. And then, over the years, groups have weaponized that. And they'll sue these permits and say, you didn't consider this species, or you didn't consider the fact that every 17 years it's a little colder than average, and therefore the water does a slightly different thing. And sometimes those things can be legitimate, often those things are not. And so the question is, what do you do about that in a way that's fair? And what you really want is a process where after a reasonable amount of time, it's done. That's what's really important, that after a reasonable amount of time, it's done. Because it's okay if the judicial review project stops a bad project, the process, right? That's fine. It's okay if the permitting process stops a bad project. That's fine. You just need to get to a yes or a no in a reasonable amount of time. We can't do the death by delay. That's not good. It's just not good. It's not good government, and it's not good for emissions. So what are the details of when we're talking about judicial review? It can be a lot of different things. It can be standing. Who can sue? Right? Do you have to have participated in public comments in advance in order to be able to sue the permit? Right? Because they say, you have a whole public comment process, and say, if anybody has concerns about this project, you have 120 days to write your comments. And then some people say, well, if you didn't do that, you shouldn't be able to sue the permit afterwards if you didn't say you should consider these things. You can't say later, I'm going to sue you for not considering the things that I didn't tell you about. Right? That's one suggestion. There's reducing the statute of limitations. Right now, after your permit, that project can get sued for up to 6 years later. 6 years. That's a long time. In the bipartisan infrastructure law, they actually reduced that 6 years to 2 for transportation projects. Mm-hmm. And if you're in a Fast 41 project, which are some of the big projects, that some of those are energy projects, those can also get that 2-year judicial review. But for most things, still 6 years. You don't need 6 years. 2 years is enough, right? 1 year is probably enough. But 2 years is definitely enough. Then there's all sorts of things about the timeline it takes at the courts. Courts have really busy dockets, and they can go appeal after appeal after appeal. You can have an injunction that stops the project. You can remand the permit back to the agency and say you have to fix this thing. And each of those things you can fiddle with in different ways, right? You can add a timeline on remand. Like if the court says, all right, we're giving you this permit back, agency, but you only have 45 days to fix this little deficient piece, right? Right, you've got this 200-page document. We think you need more in these 2 pages here. We're giving you 45 days to do that, right? Not an unlimited amount of time to do that. Like that currently exists, right? There's no timeline on remand. You could do different things with the courts, right? You could start with the technical appeals board. Like we could create a whole new court structure for energy projects and say, instead of going to lower courts, and so like, they've got, a docket of like a bazillion different types of things that, you see a judge for, you could have a special energy focus thing where the people only know energy projects, they know NEPA, that's their specialty, they're able to get to it quicker, they understand it, and then if there's a problem there, you go to an appeals board, right? That's another idea. There's a lot of different things you can do. The key is, yes, we want to keep it fair. Yes, we want to protect families, we want to protect communities, we want to protect the environment. That's what the whole process is supposed to do. If we change the project and we're not protecting people, then we don't have a good process. But right now we have a bad process. We just need to get it efficient and predictable.
Yeah, and I think it's really worth noting. I mean, people confuse this sometimes with a rubber stamp for all projects. That's not the idea. We want to get to a no faster on bad projects and to a yes faster on good projects, and that helps everybody. And I think one of the things Congressman Peters points out, and I think he was a former NEPA attorney, and he talks like the process we have now isn't necessarily protecting American communities. And he's like, we can do it better and faster and protect more American communities. I think is a really important way to look at this.
And just the last thing I'll point on to that is that our current process protects the status quo. Right? The harder it is to change things, the more you are protecting the status quo. Our status quo is bad and dangerous. Right? Our status quo is we are going to have massive, terrible climate change. Right? We can't accept that. That's not okay. We need to be able to efficiently build out clean energy infrastructure.
I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions, Flannery, or maybe 1.
We do not.
Wrong.
But that was a great message to end on. So let's have one more round of applause for Zan and Ben and Jen. Thank you, guys. Thank you. All right, now we'd like to welcome to the stage John Sabin.
Hello. So I would like to present a brief review of motivational interviewing and the core skill of reflective listening and how we can use that skill in our lobby meetings. I want to thank Elizabeth Dell and Brett Cease, Jen Tyler, and Vince Schutt for helping me to pull this together and helping me to curate my jokes. Let's see here. Do I have slides? No slides. Here we go. So it's easy to think about lobbying as if it were a game like tennis. The ball comes at you and you give it a good whack and then it goes back in the opposite direction. Like your member of Congress says, I do not support this policy. And you give that kind of like an intellectual whack and then their thought process just reverses in the other direction. And they say, yes, I do support that policy. I do. But lobbying is not like that. I think lobbying is more subtle, like the sport of curling. You all know curling? You know, this stone gets launched on the ice towards a target, and 2 people run ahead of it with brooms, sweeping the ice. And the idea is that they can subtly influence the speed and direction of the stone by sweeping in front of it. And I think our members of Congress are kind of like those stones. They have their own speed and direction, and we can't significantly change that. But what we can hope to do is to subtly influence their speed and direction. And I think motivational interviewing can give us the skills to exert that kind of subtle influence. Subtle influence might not sound like a lot to you, but if you exert subtle influence skillfully, it can lead to Olympic gold. Now, the brilliant MI trainer in Canada, Vince Schutt, who's worked a lot with CCL, introduced this concept, and he calls it the MI band of emotions. And he says that to practice motivational interviewing, you have to be coming from within this particular emotional range. And that includes empathy, acceptance, curiosity, and compassion. If you're coming from this place, then the techniques of MI will flow naturally. If you're not coming from this place, the techniques won't make any difference. It's not always easy for us to access all of this, but Vince says we have to at least access curiosity in order to make motivational interviewing work. So last summer, I got this idea that I would put Vince's idea to some sort of a test. I wanted to come up with a way to scientifically test the real-world impact of the MI band of emotions. So first of all, how many of you are familiar with the En-ROADS computer simulator? Great, a lot of you, very good. So En-ROADS, for those of you who don't know, was developed by some folks at MIT, and this is a computer climate solution simulator. So you can play with all these sliders at the bottom, and you can look at what if we had more renewable energy or more nuclear power, various things, and see how those changes will affect global temperatures over time. So what I did last summer was I built a supercomputer in my own home out of various objects I found in my kitchen. And then using that, I created my own climate simulator. And I call this En-ROADS because it measures the impact of various emotions on global temperatures over time. So here's how En-ROADS calculated the status quo. Here's where we are. So globally, we have high levels of anger, contempt, hatred, and fear. And En-ROADS projects that this will lead to a 3.8 degrees Celsius rise by the end of the century. So I asked En-ROADS to project what would happen if we substituted the MI band of emotions. And you know, I thought my machine might break. It started shaking and smoke came out of it, and it made weird noises, but it did eventually come up with a result. En-ROADS projects that high levels of empathy, acceptance, curiosity, and compassion implemented globally will keep global temperature rise below 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. And we can do even better as we pass effective climate legislation. Now, since we're a science-based organization, I have to confess that the En-ROADS model has not yet been peer-reviewed. So this is what I believe, and I invite you to believe it with me. Empathy, acceptance, curiosity, and compassion are foundational to our work. And I think we can consider these emotions a climate solution in themselves. And you could put them on your climate action to-do list, which might look something like this. 1, call Congress. 2, get heat pump. 3, practice empathy, acceptance, curiosity, and compassion. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the core skill of reflective listening, which is, of motivational interviewing, which is reflective listening. And I'm going to focus on these two elements, open-ended questions and reflections. So open-ended questions are simply questions you cannot answer with a simple yes or no. And the idea is to elicit what the other person thinks and feels. And a reflection is you paraphrase in your own words, in an empathic way, non-judgmentally, your own understanding of what they're saying as you imagine their point of view to be. Now, a reflection requires us to do two things, and they're both essential. The first step is to listen for understanding. You have to listen to the other person to form a non-judgmental view of what they're saying. Empathically, right? Trying to put yourself in their shoes. Try to see this issue from their point of view. If you don't complete this first step, which is internal, you should really not go on to the second step. So this is the first step, and it's essential. The second step is to offer a reflection by saying out loud how you understand them. Right? This is a way of checking your understanding. You tell them what you understand that they're saying, and this will prompt them to say more. Now, to make it easier for you to offer reflections, you could use this handle. What I hear you saying is. But I want to warn you again, this technique is not going to make any difference if you're in the wrong emotional place. If you're not coming from a place of empathy, if you've not made a genuine effort to understand this person from their point of view and without judgment, you really don't want to go down this road. Because if you're feeling angry at them or you think that they're stupid or wrong, and you say, what I hear you saying is, what's going to come out next is just going to be hurtful to this conversation. So you have to complete step one. You have to go to that place of empathy. Your understanding doesn't have to be correct necessarily, but you have to be genuine in your effort to understand them non-judgmentally. And if you've done that, then you could say, what I hear you saying is, and then put it out there. Bill Miller and Stephen Rolnick, who developed motivational interviewing, once wrote, the starting point for understanding motivational interviewing is understanding that it is possible to communicate in a way that elicits change talk and thereby nudges a person towards change. So what is this change talk? It's at the very heart of motivational interviewing. So a simple way to understand change talk is that it is any talk about the advantages of change or the disadvantages of the status quo. Anything the other person says that shows the advantages of change or the disadvantages of the status quo. And for our purposes, that means the advantages of passing climate-friendly legislation or the disadvantages of not doing so. So let's look at some examples of how we might do this. Oh, I'm sorry. Before we get to some examples, when we use our open-ended questions and reflections to evoke change talk, it's like using a highlighter in a text. When you highlight a text, you're not adding anything to the text. You're simply emphasizing the most important points of the text. So we're listening to what our members of Congress are saying, and we're listening for what we think is most important. And what is that? We're listening for anything that they say which might indicate what they think is the advantage of passing this legislation or the disadvantage of not doing so. And this process of finally discriminating between what we think is important, right, what we're going to reflect, what we're going to tune in on, and what we're going to disregard, this is how we sweep the ice. This is how we subtly guide that stone towards its target. So let's look at some specific examples. Now, these are both open-ended questions. What are your concerns about the Prove It Act? Or what do you like about the Prove It Act? Now, when you ask what are your concerns, what are you asking for? You're asking the person to speak negatively about the Prove It Act, right? You can see the stone starting to veer away from the target. When you ask what do you like about the Prove It Act, they start talking about, right, the benefits of it. And very subtly, that stone heads towards the target. What about these two? How do you think energy permitting reform would benefit your district or state? Or what problems do you see with the current permitting process? Actually, these both evoke change talk. The first question asks, what do you think are the advantages to passing permitting reform? And the second one asks, what are the disadvantages of not doing so? Okay? Now, what about reflections? If your member of Congress says, I'm concerned the Prove It Act is just a step towards a carbon border adjustment, which I do not support. Well, here are a couple of reflections. And they're both, legitimately reflecting what this person just said. The first one says, what I hear you saying is you do not support a carbon border adjustment. The second one, what I hear you saying is that your concern is about a carbon border adjustment, not specifically the Prove It Act. Now, the first one is highlighting their lack of support for a carbon border adjustment. You're steering the conversation that way. Your reflection steers the stone that way, away from your target. The second reflection is actually creating a little bit of separation between carbon border adjustment and the Prove It Act, right? Creating a little daylight between the two. And this very subtly steers the conversation that way. What about this example? Your member of Congress says, what remains to do on permitting reform leaves no room for bipartisan compromise. What kind of reflection could you offer to that? Well, here's a couple. And again, I think they're both legitimate in that they both reflect something about what they just said. The first one is, what I hear you saying is, there's no point in pursuing further permitting reform. And the second is, what I hear you saying is, you'd be encouraged by signs of bipartisanship on permitting reform. The first one is taking a highlighter to their sense of hopelessness. We don't really want to highlight that. We don't want the conversation to go down that road. The second one is actually doing an interesting thing where you take a negative and you turn it into a positive, right? They're saying, oh, we can't get bipartisanship on that. And you say, it sounds like you'd be encouraged if we could get some bipartisanship on that. And this might actually prompt them to think, maybe I've seen some signs of bipartisanship. And so again, you're just nudging that stone very gently towards the target. Notice that all of this subtle influence is not happening because you're expressing an opinion. It's not about your opinion. This is about what you hear them saying, and you're just picking out the parts of what they're saying that support our efforts, and we're highlighting it. And that in itself directs the conversation towards the goal of support for the bills we're lobbying for. Now, when you do want to share your own ideas, in motivational interviewing, there is a technique for that. And the idea is first you ask permission to share. And that might be as simple as saying, may I respond to what you just said? This is a very polite thing to do. And it tells the speaker that you are willing to keep listening if they're not done talking. And when they do give you permission, then you want to share your own ideas briefly and succinctly, and then ask them what they think about what you just said, so you can go back to listening. Now, sharing your idea briefly is really important. I think the most common mistake that we all make in lobby meetings is we talk too much. So here's a fun exercise that you can try to train yourselves to be briefer in the way you talk about legislation. I want you to think about the English language version of a Japanese haiku. That's 17 syllables over 3 lines in the form of 5 syllables and then 7 and then 5. And can you write a haiku about the bills we're lobbying on? So, for example, you might write, gathering data on the emissions content of various goods. Now, this is never going to win a poetry prize, but this is 17 syllables that I think is a pretty good description of the Prove It Act. So I want to introduce to you now the first ever CCL Legislative Haiku Challenge. We have 4 categories for each of our 4 asks, and you all have the opportunity to write your own haiku and submit them by 1:30 p.m. tomorrow. And then you get to vote on your favorite poems. And voting will continue till 5 p.m. Tuesday, and we will announce the winners at the reception Tuesday night. You can submit your poems and vote at cclusa.org/haiku. Now, a year ago, we practiced reflective listening in this room, and afterwards, two people, different parts of the room, approached me and said, the people at my table were practicing reflective listening in an aggressive manner. Now, the only way you can do that is if you're not coming from the MI band of emotions, right? Well, if you're coming from a place of anger, or you think the other person is stupid or wrong, then that's what's going to happen. It's going to come out like it's aggressive. So once again, the important thing is getting yourself in the right emotional place. But when I think about practicing reflective listening in an aggressive manner, it makes me think about cats. Now, some of you may have had this experience, and if not, I think you could probably imagine this. You've got a beloved house cat, and one day you're coming home, and maybe you've got your arms full of groceries, and as you come in the front door, the cat slips between your legs, gets outside, and disappears. And you might be tempted to drop your groceries and run outside, chasing the cat, shouting its name. But if you did that, you'd probably soon learn that this is a poor strategy. Because cats tend to run away from people who are running after them and shouting. And cats are faster than you. So a much better strategy is to go outside with a bowl of your cat's favorite food, sit down quietly somewhere, maybe where the cat can see you, and let the cat come to you. Now, I think members of Congress are like cats. If you chase after them shouting, you will never catch them. A better strategy is to bring a bowl of your members' favorite food into their office, sit there quietly, and let them come to you. Now, we all know cats are really finicky about food, very particular about it. And so are members of Congress. Some members of Congress really love the smell of climate action. So you could bring that kind of food into their office. Some members of Congress really don't like that smell at all. They might be more drawn to the delicious scent of grid reliability. Or maybe the enchanting aroma of international trade negotiations that favor the United States. But the important thing is you need to know what your members' favorite food is and bring that food to your lobby meetings, and then let your members of Congress come to you. Now, I want to do a brief review of my brief review. Lobbying is subtle, like curling. Empathy, acceptance, curiosity, and compassion are a necessary foundation to our work. Use open-ended questions and reflections to evoke change talk or support for climate-friendly legislation. If you're coming from the right emotional place, use this handle. What I hear you saying is, ask for permission before you share. Be brief. And then, maybe most important, bring a bowl of your members' favorite food into their office, and then let the cat come to you. Are there any questions back there, Flannery?
John, you were so wonderful that we've clapped through our question time. We are close to the end, so if you could just go ahead and explain the lobby meeting team planning time, that would be great.
So the next thing we're going to do, if you've got a 2 o'clock lobby meeting, we're setting aside the next 45 minutes to have a planning meeting with your team. If you've got a 3 o'clock lobby meeting, you can do that at 5:15. You can do that in this room, or the diplomat, congressional, and ambassador rooms are also available. If you are not going to be doing the lobby team planning, we're going to ask you to please leave this room to have social conversations elsewhere. And also, if you go to page 20 on your program, there are some other suggested times when you might meet with your lobby teams. So have great lobby meetings, everybody. Thank you.